She told me to close the curtains first, and in that simple moment my heart stopped. The first time I saw her, I didn't know my life would tilt so quietly yet so profoundly. I had gone to her apartment to deliver a small package, nothing unusual, really, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt the air change, as though the space itself had been waiting for me. The room smelled faintly of old books and something warm, almost like vanilla with a trace of lavender. It was comforting, familiar in a way that made me both relaxed and suddenly aware of every small movement. She stood by the window, sunlight filtering softly through the half-drawn curtains, outlining her figure. I noticed the effortless grace in her posture, the way her shoulders relaxed, but her presence still commanded attention. She was in her early 40s, but the elegance she carried made age feel irrelevant. There was confidence in the tilt of her chin, yet her eyes held a subtle, quiet vulnerability, something you could only notice if you paused long enough to really see. "Close the curtains first," she said, her voice calm but unexpectedly intimate. It wasn't an order, it was a simple instruction, yet it struck me. The way she phrased it, with a soft insistence and a hint of playfulness in the corners of her lips, made my heart skip. I paused, holding the curtain rod, suddenly self-conscious, aware of my own clumsiness, my youthful eagerness. I reached for the curtains, feeling the textured fabric beneath my fingers, and in that small motion, our hands brushed. It was nothing by the measure of a touch, but in that instant, a spark ignited, like the faintest current running along the skin, barely noticeable yet undeniable. She looked at me then, really looked, and I felt caught in the warmth of her gaze. Her eyes softened, almost imperceptibly, and I imagined I could see her measuring me, weighing something beyond what words could say. There was a quiet rhythm to her movements, a slow elegance, as she adjusted the sunlight filtering through the room. She turned to hand me the package, and our fingers met for a fleeting second. My heart thumped audibly, or at least I felt like it did, and a small, unbidden smile escaped her lips. It was nothing overt, nothing dramatic, but it held a weight that left me both flustered and intrigued. In that first encounter, there was no dramatic confession, no sparkly cinematic moment, only a quiet tension, subtle and strange, woven into the mundane task of closing curtains and handing over a package. And yet my chest felt heavier, my mind sharper, more aware of every small detail, the way her hair fell across her shoulder, the calm steadiness of her voice, the warmth lingering from a handbrush that lasted barely a heartbeat. I left her apartment that day with a strange mixture of embarrassment and anticipation. I didn't know it yet, but the words, "Close the curtains first," had etched themselves into my mind, a simple instruction now carrying a weight I couldn't define. Something had shifted, an invisible thread, delicate but strong, had tied my curiosity, my admiration, and something deeper entirely to her. And I would follow that thread carefully, silently, wherever it might lead. After that first encounter, I found myself thinking about her more than I expected. It wasn't just the way she looked or moved, it was the quiet magnetism she carried. There was a rhythm to her presence, like a soft melody that lingered long after it was gone. I caught myself replaying small moments, the tilt of her head when she laughed at something I had said, the subtle curve of her smile when she watched me fumble with the curtains. Our encounters became frequent, almost casually so, yet every meeting held a tension that neither of us acknowledged openly. Sometimes it was at the cafe where she ordered her coffee the same way every morning, or in the library where she lingered in the same aisle, flipping through books with meticulous care. I would watch, pretending to focus on my own task, but my eyes kept drifting to her. There was something magnetic in the way she let her fingers graze the spines of the books, a delicate grace and motion that contrasted sharply with the solid confidence in her posture. One afternoon, we reached for the same book. Our hands touched lightly, fingers brushing in a fleeting, accidental contact, yet it sent a ripple through me, a warmth I hadn't expected, a pulse of connection that left my palms tingling. She didn't pull away, only looked at me for a beat longer than socially necessary. The way her eyes held mine, steady and quietly amused, made my chest tighten with anticipation. Her smile was soft, unassuming, yet it had the power to unravel my careful composure in seconds. Even mundane actions became charged with subtle intimacy. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and I noticed the faint scent that lingered. Lavender, perhaps, or something uniquely hers. It was calming, grounding, yet somehow it pulled me closer emotionally. We shared small smiles, brief exchanges of words that seemed inconsequential to anyone else, but to me, they were threaded with unspoken meaning. Every glance held a question, every pause a silent invitation to step closer. I started noticing how my own body responded to her presence, a sudden awareness of posture, the way my hands fidgeted when I thought she was looking, the slow, involuntary deepening of my breath when our proximity shrank even slightly. There was a strange comfort in her nearness, a gentle reassurance that drew me in, even as my mind tried to caution me about the age difference, about the inexplicable tension that now defined every interaction. By the end of the week, I realized I was waiting for these small encounters with a mix of dread and anticipation, longing and hesitation. Every lingering glance, every brief brush of hands, became a quiet heartbeat in a story I hadn't yet begun to understand. And through it all, she remained quietly enigmatic, aware of her effect, yet never forcing it, leaving the moments suspended in that delicate balance between distance and closeness. It was in these small, almost imperceptible moments that I began to understand the depth of my fascination with her. And as I walked away each time, I felt a strange combination of satisfaction and yearning, knowing that our connection, though unspoken, was quietly growing stronger, invisible threads weaving us closer with each shared glance. It was during one of our increasingly frequent encounters that I first saw her vulnerability, a quiet fissure in the otherwise unshakable poise she carried. We were sitting in her living room, a soft rain tapping against the window, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. I had come by under the guise of helping her organize a stack of old books, but the evening quickly turned more intimate than I expected. She was unusually still that day, her eyes distant as she traced the rim of her coffee cup with a delicate finger. I noticed the slight slump of her shoulders, the subtle tightness in her jaw, and the way her fingers trembled just enough to catch my attention. Without thinking, I reached out, brushing my hand lightly over her arm, not in a commanding gesture, but as a grounding presence. Her skin was warm and soft, a quiet comfort that seemed to whisper permission for closeness. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and I felt the weight of her hesitation in the space between us. Then she sighed, barely audible, and confided something small yet intimate, an insecurity, a fear she rarely allowed anyone to see. Her voice was gentle, with a tremor that made the words almost more fragile than the air they traveled through. Listening, I felt a protective instinct stir within me, a desire to be the one steady enough to hold her in that moment, to meet her quiet need with quiet strength. She didn't pull away when my hand lingered on her arm, only shifted slightly closer, as if acknowledging the comfort of the gesture. I could feel the subtle warmth of her skin through the sleeve of her blouse, a soft pressure that anchored the fluttering in my chest. Her eyes met mine then, and for the first time, I saw the mixture of trust, hesitation, and longing there, emotions she hadn't allowed herself to show anyone so openly in years. The rain outside added to the intimacy, a rhythmic backdrop that softened the edges of the room and made the silence between us feel purposeful, meaningful. I noticed the way her hair fell loosely across her shoulders, the quiet rise and fall of her breathing, and the gentle pressure of her hand when she tentatively rested it near mine. It was a delicate balance of closeness and respect, each movement steeped in subtle intimacy. By the time she finished speaking, I realized how deeply this moment had affected me. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was real, raw, unguarded, and profoundly moving. I wanted to tell her everything I felt, but I held back, recognizing the power in simply being present, and allowing her vulnerability to exist without rushing it or filling it with words. As I left her apartment that night, the quiet warmth of our shared moment lingered. I understood then that our connection was no longer just curiosity or admiration, it was becoming trust, subtly entwined with something deeper, a bond built in fleeting touches, lingering glances, and the courage to show quiet vulnerability. And I knew, with a certainty that made my chest ache, that this slow-burning connection was only beginning to take root. That evening, I found myself at her apartment again, ostensibly to help her with the curtains, but I sensed from the moment I arrived that the night would carry an intimacy far beyond mere household tasks. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, its soft glow reflecting on the polished surfaces, casting gentle shadows that made everything feel quieter, more private. The air smelled faintly of her perfume, a subtle mix of vanilla and something uniquely her own, warm, grounding, and intoxicatingly familiar. We stood side by side at the window, adjusting the heavy fabric of the curtains. Our shoulders brushed lightly, an almost accidental contact, yet the sensation lingered in a way that made my chest tighten. The warmth of her arm against mine was subtle but electric, and I caught myself imagining how it would feel if I could stay that close indefinitely. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted slightly toward me, as though sharing the small space was natural, almost comforting. "Careful with that edge," she murmured, her voice low and steady, brushing past my ear. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, not from fear, but from the closeness, the intimacy of her tone. I realized then that the physical proximity was doing more than moving curtains. It was moving something in me, something unspoken and profoundly stirring. As we worked together, our hands brushed repeatedly, and each contact left a faint warmth in its wake, a pulse of connection neither of us fully acknowledged. The rhythm of our movements created an unspoken choreography, her reaching up, me stepping just behind, shoulders occasionally pressing, fingers grazing. Every glance we exchanged held a weight, a quiet acknowledgement of the tension simmering between us. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of fabric and the distant hum of city life outside. I noticed her eyes catching mine in fleeting moments, subtle glances that held more meaning than words ever could. She tilted her head ever so slightly when I asked a question, and I felt the intimacy of that simple gesture. There was a softness in her gaze, a mixture of trust and something more elusive, something I longed to understand. At one point, she leaned closer to adjust a fold, and the warmth of her body pressed gently against mine. My pulse quickened, awareness sharpening with each subtle touch. I could feel the steady beat of her presence beside me, her breath brushing the nape of my neck, her hand hovering briefly near mine as if testing the space between closeness and connection. In that delicate balance, I felt an undeniable magnetic pull, a quiet ache of anticipation. By the time the curtains were drawn, the room had transformed from a simple task into a private world, suspended in time. The small, accidental touches and the quiet exchange of glances had built a tension that neither of us needed to voice. I realized, as I stepped back and met her eyes, that the closeness had revealed something profound. Our connection was no longer casual curiosity. It had become an intimate dance of trust, warmth, and subtle desire, quietly unfolding between us. It was a quiet evening when the words finally came. We were sitting in her living room again, the room bathed in the soft amber glow of a single lamp, the curtains drawn tight as she once instructed. Outside, the city hummed faintly, distant and unintrusive, as if giving us permission to exist in our own suspended world. I had come to help her with some paperwork, something mundane, yet the air between us carried a tension that had been building for weeks, silent, unspoken, but undeniable. She was sitting across from me, her posture relaxed yet perfectly composed, the faint curve of her shoulders softened by the gentle light. I noticed the way her hand rested lightly on the arm of the chair, the subtle warmth of her skin visible even in the dim light. For the first time, I realized I could no longer ignore the depth of feeling that had quietly taken root within me. My chest felt heavy with anticipation, my fingers twitching slightly as if they knew the confession that my lips had not yet formed. "Can I tell you something?" I asked, my voice tentative, almost hesitant. She looked up, her gaze meeting mine with an attentiveness that made my heart skip. Her eyes softened, curiosity and quiet encouragement blending into a warmth that made it impossible to turn back. I've been thinking about you," I began carefully, aware of the fragile balance in our connection. "More than I probably should. More than I even realize sometimes. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I can't ignore it anymore." Her hand moved slightly, brushing against mine, not deliberately, perhaps, but in a way that made my pulse quicken. The warmth of her skin, the subtle pressure against my fingers, grounded me even as my nerves fluttered. For a moment, silence stretched between us, but it wasn't awkward. It was expectant, filled with the weight of emotions that had been quietly accumulating in our shared moments, touches, glances, and the gentle intimacy of proximity. She exhaled softly, leaning forward just a little, the light catching the highlights in her hair. "I've noticed," she said quietly, her voice steady yet tender. "I've noticed everything, more than you know. And I feel it too. I've been trying to make sense of it, trying to understand what it means, but I can't deny it anymore either." Her hand lifted fully this time, brushing the back of my hand, lingering with a softness that felt like an unspoken promise. My heart swelled at the simple gesture. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a mutual understanding that the connection between us had grown beyond curiosity, beyond admiration. It was real, emotional, and deeply felt. We didn't rush. There were no dramatic declarations, no overwhelming gestures. Instead, there was this gentle, profound acknowledgement, a shared awareness that we were both navigating something delicate, something significant. And as our eyes met, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, for her honesty, for the trust we had built, and for the quiet, undeniable pull that had finally been voiced. For the first time, the space between us felt safe to cross, even if just a little, guided by trust, warmth, and the unspoken promise of something slowly, carefully growing between us. The evening was still, almost hushed, as if the world itself had stepped back to let us exist in our own private space. We were sitting together on her balcony, the city lights flickering in the distance, casting a gentle glow across her face. The air was warm but carried the faint crispness of early autumn, and the faint scent of jasmine from a nearby planter mingled with the delicate trace of her perfume. It was in these small sensory details, the feel of the cool breeze, the rustle of leaves, the way the light kissed her features, that I realized how deeply I had come to notice her, every subtle nuance of her presence. We didn't speak much. Words felt unnecessary. The quiet stretched comfortably between us, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and the soft tapping of a loose shutter in the wind. And yet, in that silence, the tension between us was almost palpable. Each small movement carried weight. The way our shoulders brushed when she shifted slightly, the subtle contact of our hands as we reached for the same cup of tea, and the gentle warmth that radiated from her as she leaned back against the railing. I became acutely aware of every detail, her fingers lightly grazing the rim of her mug, the way her hair fell across her cheek, the gentle rise and fall of her breath. When our hands accidentally touched, the fleeting contact was enough to send a wave of warmth through me, a quiet spark that seemed to linger long after we had separated. There was something intoxicating in the proximity, the unspoken acknowledgement of desire that neither of us dared voice fully. She glanced at me, her eyes soft but steady, and I felt the weight of that look settle in my chest. It was as though she could see all the thoughts I had tried to hide, the longing, the hesitation, the quiet ache of wanting to be closer. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance, yet there was a mutual understanding that some things were better expressed through presence rather than words. Her head leaned just slightly toward mine, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that brought a rush of awareness to my senses. The warmth of her shoulder against mine, the faint brush of her hair along my arm, the sound of her quiet breathing, they all combined into a single, intense sensation that was both comforting and electrifying. Every instinct told me to move closer, to bridge the gap, yet respect and the slow rhythm of our connection held me in place. In that shared silence, desire existed not as a desperate need but as a gentle, simmering acknowledgement, a quiet pull that made each glance, each touch, charged with meaning. It was a tension built not on words or declarations but on trust, on subtle intimacy, and on the unspoken promise that we were learning to navigate together. By the time the night drew on, I realized something profound. Desire didn't always need to be overt. Sometimes it lived in the quiet, in the lingering touches, in the warmth of a shared space, and in the electric, unspoken connection that had been growing between us since the moment she said, "Close the curtains first." The evening felt different from all the others, though the setting was familiar. Her apartment was softly lit, the curtains drawn as she had once instructed, filtering the city lights into a gentle, comforting glow. The air smelled faintly of her perfume, and the lingering scent of jasmine from her balcony plants. There was a quietness to the room, a sense of completion, as if the space itself had been waiting for this moment. We sat together on the couch, side by side, our shoulders lightly touching. There was no need for words. The silence was warm and shared, filled with all the understanding and trust that had been carefully built over countless glances, brushes of hands, and quiet confessions. Her presence was steadying, grounding me, and I realized how much I had come to crave the simplicity of just being near her. Her head tilted slightly, and she let it rest briefly against my shoulder. I felt the softness of her hair against my neck, the gentle pressure of her cheek, and the warmth of her body that radiated calm and reassurance. I brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, letting my fingers linger at the nape of her neck, feeling the subtle pulse of life there. It was an intimacy born of trust, of patience, of knowing each other's rhythms without needing to force anything. Our hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining with ease. The touch was simple, yet it carried the weight of all we had shared, the curiosity, the subtle tension, the vulnerability, and the quiet acknowledgement of desire. Every brush of her fingers against mine was a small, comforting affirmation that the connection we had nurtured so carefully was now real, mutual, and enduring. She smiled softly, a slow, warm smile that reached her eyes and made my chest ache with quiet joy. "Thank you for closing the curtains first," she said, her tone gentle, almost teasing, yet layered with all the meaning our journey had accumulated. I laughed softly, the tension of weeks of longing and unspoken feelings dissolving in that single moment of shared understanding. If there were others involved, the room would have held them too, an unspoken harmony where everyone's presence was acknowledged and respected. The dynamic was inclusive, tender, and emotionally satisfying, without the need for words to spell it out. The warmth of togetherness, the subtle touches, and the shared glances were enough to convey love and acceptance, leaving everyone feeling seen and connected. We remained like that for a long time, simply sitting, breathing, and occasionally exchanging soft touches and lingering glances. The world outside faded, leaving only the comfort of presence, the quiet joy of being near someone who understood you, who saw you fully and accepted every part of you. In that final moment, I realized that the age gap, the hesitation, and the slow-burning tension had all been part of a journey that made this connection richer, more meaningful. It wasn't a story of instant passion but of patience, trust, and shared vulnerability. And as I felt her warmth beside me, the steady rhythm of our hands entwined, I knew that this was the culmination of everything, the quiet, beautiful realization that we had arrived together, in a place of intimacy, understanding, and heartfelt connection.